In no time, the Ursuline had swallowed up every bone. A dreadful silence fell over the forest. Now there was only the soft howling wind. She supposed the beast had finally succumbed to the tranquilizing flowers. It was time to collect its blood. She spotted the magic axe below, faintly glimmering in a dusty ray of light that shone through the hollow. The wooden handle had shattered in the fall, and only a short, splintered chunk remained with the blade. The blade was all that mattered, and she climbed down from her perch to retrieve it. A hazy glow illuminated her hand as she gripped the axe head. Then a deep growl rumbled just outside the tree. The Ursuline was plenty awake, and she froze in fear as it sniffed around the outside of the tree. Suddenly, the clawed arm of the beast burst through the hollow and slashed at Isabel blindly. Its nails ripped through the hem of her gown easily as she lost her balance and fell backwards. The angry animal tried to force its giant head into the hollow, but it wouldn't fit, and it snorted in frustration. How long does it take those silly flowers to work? Isabel wondered, terrified. Outside, the beast roared and slashed wildly at the dry, rotted trunk. Splinters of wood exploded into the tree. It was widening the opening. Isabel looked out in a horror as the Ursuline roared, then ran full force, straight at the hollow. Its giant head crashed through with a rabid violence. Only its thick shoulders stopped its surge. The beast was stunned for a moment, then its eyes searched the hollow wildly until it spotted Isabel. It let out a low, wet groan, greedy for another easy meal. Drool dripped slowly from its chin as it just stared dead-eyed, waiting for Isabel to make a move. One more big push, and it would have her. She looked at the axe blade in her hand. She had been squeezing it so tightly that her knuckles were white. The beast growled again as Isabel got back to her feet. She moved slowly across the back of the tree, careful to stay out of reach. Then she climbed back atop the perch just above the hollow. When the beast could no longer see Isabel, it went completely mad. It dug its claws into the ground and pulled its body further into the tree. The sound of the cracking trunk echoed inside the hollow. The old wood was surrendering to the beast's power. Desperately, it wriggled and twisted its body further inside, then rolled over on its back to locate its prey. Isabel was waiting directly above. She had the advantage now, and a sly smile crossed her face as she raised the broken axe high over her head. She hurled the blade down at the beast with all her strength and all the anger she held inside. The axe sunk straight into the beast's snout with a heavy thump. It roared in agony as blood squirted from the wound, and it flailed wildly across the forest floor, backwards through the dense vegetation. Then just as suddenly, there was silence. After a few moments, Isabel poked her head out of the tree. The beast lay on its side in a fluffy patch of ferns, its chest heaving steadily up and down. Isabel grabbed her jar of water and thirstily drank up what was left. Then she approached the beast cautiously. Its eyes were still open, frozen in shock. Its body was completely rigid, except for the occasional twitch of its hind legs. Blood was still spurting from its snout, and she soon filled the empty jar with it. There was nothing to do now but return to the blood tree and collect a splinter. When Isabel reached the blood tree, it seemed quite surprised, in its own subtle way, to see her again.
Little one, you have returned. I had begun to think that I would never be able to leave this dark and lonely prison. You have succeeded where others have failed. Pour the beast's blood over my roots and unbind me.
She did as the tree asked, and once the roots fully absorbed the magic blood, they uprooted easily from the ground. The blood tree rumbled around the forest, picking and eating fruit from a cherry tree, then soft green mosses from the ground. Its dark disposition was gone, lifted like a fog, and it wandered freely through the midnight forest, no longer its captive. Finally, the tree stopped in front of Isabel.
I mustn't waste any time finding more of my kind. I've always dreamed of a crystal lake surrounded by 1,000 blood trees. It always seemed so vivid to me that I wonder if it might have been where I was born. Isabel, you've saved me from a dreary life of boredom and solitude, and I gladly honor your request.
The blood tree plucked a handful of splinters from its side and presented them to Isabel. She pinned them in her hair to hide them. As the tree leaned down and whispered a secret of the forest it hoped might be useful to her on her journey. Then the blood tree ran through the forest as only a giant tree could run, kicking up sand and dirt and sending leaves and pine needles flying through the air. Isabel ran in the opposite direction. She passed through the garden of the dead again, which was thick with dreamy flowers, then past the still sleeping magic beast. Soon she came to a stream with the clearest, cleanest water she had ever seen. She bent down and captured some of the cold liquid in her cupped hands, then lifted it to her mouth and drank deeply. Just on the other side of the stream, in a clearing, was a cabin similar to Maglie's, but the roof and sides were covered with living material. Herbs, fungi, mosses, and even tiny shrubs of some sort. Thick smoke billowed out of the chimney. As Isabel stalked quietly through the woods to conceal her presence, she noticed that these woods were devoid of that ominous feeling that the midnight forest had. Everything seemed brighter, sunnier, almost welcoming. Isabel worked her way through the woods until she edged right up to the cabin. From this hidden spot, she was able to peer through one of the windows. An elegantly dressed man with raven-colored hair and smooth ebony skin walked through the center of the house toward the front door. The house was bustling with at least half a dozen crows, and they seemed to be working together to make some kind of stew in a cauldron in the fireplace. As the man left through the front door, he called back in a deep, booming voice.
I'm going to pick some of those mushrooms we all like that grow underneath the waterfall. Don't you dare eat without me.
Then he closed the heavy door behind him and followed a well-trod path into the woods. That had to be the warlock, Isabel thought to herself. Then all at once, the rich, savory aroma of the hearty stew reached her nose. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until now. Almost as if under a spell, she was drawn closer to the window and the tantalizing smells coming from the cabin. Suddenly the crows flew out of the chimney above, like a burst of black smoke, and they soared over the path the warlock had followed. This was her opportunity, and she tried to think of a plan. She could hide somewhere in the cabin and attack the warlock when his back was turned. Or she could mix the splinters in the stew. Perhaps the warlock would bite down on one, or have it stick in the back of his throat when he swallowed. Better yet, she could hide the splinters in his bed, or a chair or the floor, so that the warlock would accidentally sit or step on one. Finally, She decided she would stick a few of the splinters on the underside of the front door handle, so that when the warlock returned and entered his cabin, they would surely pierce his skin.
What if he uses the back door?
A deep knowing voice behind her said. She whipped her head around. She was face to face with the warlock. His eyes were mesmerizing as he continued.
Or what if he doesn't use a door at all?
In sheer panic, Isabel's mind raced. Should she run and hope he didn't follow? Could she pull one of the splinters from her hair and stick him before he could react? With each idea that ran through her mind, the warlock's eyebrows raised as if daring her. He was reading her thoughts and laughing at them. Her body trembled uncontrollably. And for the first time in her journey, she felt hopeless.
Breathe, child. I mean you no harm.
He assured her. Then he gently took her hand and led her to his cabin.
I suppose that lying witch Maglie sent you, no?
He continued. Isabel lowered her head and nodded. My true love will die if I don't do what she asks.
Well, you simply can't believe anything she says. Come, sit at my table.
The warlock said as he pulled out a chair for her.
Let me guess. She told you that I was not to be trusted and deviously stole her book of spells.
Isabel nodded sheepishly.
I bet she failed to mention, though, that I was her servant for years, that she turned me into a warlock for that very purpose, that she treated me horribly until finally I outsmarted her and broke her bounds over me. Now she sends someone else to do her dirty work, to bind me again and steal back her precious book.
Isabel stuttered.
It's of no consequence, child. I will freely give you that ridiculous book of vanity spells. Poor Maglie, always up to the same old tricks.
He removed a book from his cloak and laid it on the table. Then he filled a bowl with stew and pressed it into her hands. You no longer need the book to break her bounds? Isabel asked. The warlock chuckled.
For far too long, I imagined the answers I was seeking were in that book. But alas, it is only blood magic and beauty spells.
The warlock poured himself a bowl of stew and sat down across from Isabel.
My name is Anan, or at least that was my name when I was a man.
My name is Isabel, she replied.
I am honored to meet you, Isabel,
he said as he kissed her hand. Isabel ravenously ate up the hearty stew as she told Anan of her quest, and how she no longer had the obsidian stone needed to save her sweet Aaron. If she harms so much as a hair on his head, I will kill her, Isabel cried. Anan warned her that she would be a fool to try to oppose Maglie. She was still a witch, after all. He assured her that Maglie would never have kept her promise to release Aaron, no matter if Isabel had done everything she asked, including returning with the obsidian necklace.
The blood of a pure soul is coveted above all, but she cannot simply kill a man and take it. They must have wronged her or intruded in some way, or they must give it freely. She tricked you into delivering Aaron's to her on a silver platter. I am afraid there is only one way to save your beloved, and it would come at great sacrifice to yourself,
Anan declared. I will do anything, Isabel replied. Anan sighed deeply.
You will be cursed forever, like me. There is a spell that I can teach you that is much too strong for Maglie to resist, but it is a spell only a witch can cast.
Then he removed his ring and laid it on the table. It held a large black obsidian stone.
To become a witch, you must take a piece of my stone. Then by your own will, you must pierce your heart with it,
Anan said. And then he looked almost ashamed to have said it out loud.
Once you have cast your spell on Maglie, you will press your chest to Aaron's. Your stone will absorb his, and he will be restored to you. But you must understand, this will change the course of your life forever. There are infinite outcomes that I cannot foresee, but most of them will be tragic.
Is there no other way to save him? Isabel asked, her voice and lip quivering.
I'm afraid not, and I have yet to tell you the worst part. This spell, once cast, will drain most of your life force. It will age you, wither you, deform you, so much so that you may be unrecognizable to Aaron. You may find that his love is only skin deep.
What about the beauty spells in Maglie's book? Isabel asked as she frantically thumbed through the pages. Anan calmly placed his hand over the writing.
There is plenty a witch can do to restore their youth, but it all comes with a price. Some magic requires acts so vile, it would darken your soul eternally.
I have no choice, Isabel replied, as a tear rolled down her cheek. I can't leave my love to die. Not at the hands of that awful fiend.
I have warned you, that is all I can do.
Then he dug his long, sharp fingernail into the obsidian ring. A perfect diamond-shaped piece broke off onto the table. He pushed it slowly to Isabel. She took it from him without hesitation. Without Aaron, I might as well be dead anyhow, she thought to herself. And then almost involuntarily, she stabbed herself in the chest in the same spot she had seen Maglie's own shard. It stung like 1,000 bee stings, then it burned like the sun. Slowly the pain subsided and her entire body went cold. Her skin paled, but she felt stronger.
It is done. We have no time to waste. I must teach you the spell and send you on your way. You must still remove the stone from Aaron's heart while blood still pumps through his body.
The spell was short, only 4 lines, and luckily it had an easy natural rhythm to it. Anan warned her not to speak it aloud until she was face to face with Maglie. She would only have the power to recite it once. Then they bid each other farewell, and with nothing but Aaron's knife and the book of spells, she was on her way, back to the midnight forest and Maglie's cabin. Her energy seemed boundless now, and she wondered if she would ever need to sleep again. She passed the magic beast. He was on his feet now, but still drunk from the red flower's nectar, stumbling through the woods, oblivious to her presence. She crossed the garden of the dead and noticed a single noxious zombie weed reaching out from one corner. She owed it to Joshua to be the sworn protector of this garden now, and she promised herself she would return when her task was complete. As she stumbled through the dark forest, she loosened her blouse to reveal the obsidian protruding from her heart. As she expected, the sprites were attracted to it, just the same as with the necklace, but now it seemed the buzzing cherubs could not burn her. Once she was through the midnight forest, she covered her stone and the sprites dispersed. The sun began to set as she neared Maglie's cabin. Then curiously, it began to rain. Nervously, she went over the spell again and again in her mind. She worried when it was time. Would she be able to recite it correctly? Thunder rolled as she approached the cabin's porch. Then lightning struck, and a familiar voice behind her said,
I see you've retrieved my book of spells. Quite impressive. But alas, you are too late.
You said when the sun has set on the 3rd day. The sun still peeks from underneath the storm clouds, Isabel protested.
But this is the 4th sunset, dear. You must have lost track of time. Now hand over my book of spells and perhaps we can strike some kind of bargain.
I'm going to see my Aaron, Isabel said, as she continued to the cabin.
You dare defy me? I'll turn you into a weed. Now hand over what is mine.
Isabel threw the book to the ground and grabbed Maglie by the wrist. Maglie looked confused when she couldn't easily wrest herself free. Isabel chanted, Sarvath Elder Mirantor. Maglie's eyes grew wide as she tore free.
You fool! You will rue the day you dare try to cast a spell on me.
The forest flashed in a haunting purple light as Maglie's eyes glowed furiously. Vithran Solath Eldador. Maglie glared.
So the clever warlock has tricked you too. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised.
And then she bent the trees that surrounded them with her power, and the bodies of the men still hanging there convulsed and twitched, as if reanimated by her electricity.
Surely you know that only a witch can perform a spell.
Isabel pulled back her blouse to reveal the obsidian stone that was buried in her heart. Maglie's face turned pale as a ghost, frozen with shock. Then, as if accepting her fate, she said coldly,
Silly girl. You belong to him now.
Isabel spoke the last line. Amari Sarvath Vithranor. Maglie's body went rigid, and she screamed the most awful scream. A scream that seemed to freeze in her throat as she turned into a statue of pure black obsidian stone. It was the most beautiful statue Isabel had ever seen. In a way, it was what Maglie had been searching for. Her beauty would be preserved in time, never to fade, never to wither. The rain stopped, and the low light shifted in such a way that Isabel caught her reflection in the glassy obsidian effigy. Her hair had turned grey, her eyes set back deep in her skull, wrapped in puffy wrinkles. Her nose and cheeks were spotted with pits and moles, and her lips and gums had receded. She appeared as though she were 100 years old. Then she looked at her once delicate hands. They were thin and gnarly, the knuckles bulging through her paper-like skin. She recognized nothing of herself but her eyes. Even when the eyes begin to fail, something essential always remains. Suddenly, there was a loud moan from the cabin. "Aaron!" she gasped. Then with difficulty, she ascended the porch stairs. She was exhausted now. The one spell had taken everything from her. She was terrified when she saw Aaron hanging by his feet from the rafters. His eyes were closed, but he was groaning and spasming, as if lost in a bad dream. Blood trickled slowly from his heart, then down his neck and across his face, into the wooden barrel he hung above. Isabel pushed the barrel away and layered the floor with the straw-filled burlap sacks that had served as Maglie's bed. She moved the stool to where she could stand to cut the rope that held Aaron to the rafters. Her knife cut the rope easily, and he fell on the burlap sacks harmlessly. She tore open his coat and shirt and laid against his chest so that the stone in his heart aligned with her own. She felt an intense burning sensation as her stone absorbed Aaron's. She pushed herself up with her arms a bit and watched as the hole in Aaron's chest healed before her eyes. The color returned to his face and he began breathing peacefully. Then he opened his eyes. Confused and groggy, he just stared at her, not saying a word. There was a pot of water and a rag near the fireplace, and Isabel used it to clean the blood from Aaron's face. His features were sharp and handsome, and suddenly Isabel felt ashamed of the way she looked. "I'm sorry, my love. The spell I used to save you has made me ugly and old." Aaron's eyes then focused on her own, and all of a sudden he screamed and pushed her hand away.
No!
He seemed to be in shock. She tried to soothe him again with the wet rag, but he yelled at her,
Get your hands off me, you miserable hag!
and he pushed her away. Aaron, my love, it is me, your sweet Isabel, she pleaded. But Aaron kicked at her as he pushed back against the cabin wall, trying to stand. Isabel sat up. Look into my eyes and you'll see that it's true. But Aaron ran from the cabin screaming. Isabel rose and followed him out the door. He ran through the woods, looking back over his shoulder, petrified as he made his way to the trail back to Willow's Grove. Isabel called after him, but he continued to run as if his life depended on it. When he reached the trail, he surprised Isabel by continuing up the ridge towards the next town instead of back towards Willow's Grove. She did not follow him. She sat by the trail and cried. Her heart was broken. She cried until the moon came out. Then she just stared at it until it was replaced by the sun. The morning light was warm and seemed to soothe the aching feeling a little. She rose, then wandered aimlessly, following a cool breeze until she stumbled into Willow's Grove. Though they wouldn't recognize her, perhaps the familiar sight of her school children's faces would cheer her up just a bit. But the children threw pebbles at her from under porches, and young maidens shut their windows frantically as she passed the rows of houses. The travelling parson yelled at her viciously.
You are not welcome here, old crone. Leave now and never return.
Then he worked the townsfolk into a frenzy. The same ones who had locked their doors to her that fateful night. And they all chased her away from town. What a price she had paid for love. And now there was nowhere for her to go. No place where she would be welcomed. So she just wandered back to Maglie's cabin and tried to think about what she could do next, but every thought just brought more bitterness. She picked up the book of spells from where she had thrown it to the ground and brought it inside with her. She would study it later. For now, all she wanted was to sleep. She laid down on the burlap sacks in front of the fire and tried her best to relax. Just as her eyes grew heavy, there was a knock at the cabin door. Was it Aaron? Had he come back for her? She sat up and struggled to stand. She was exhausted. As she rose, the door burst open with a crash. In the doorway stood the travelling parson from Willow's Grove.
Maglie, where are you?
When he saw Isabel instead, a bit of shock crossed his face.
You! I knew you were a witch when I saw you in town.
He snarled as he stumbled through the door and demanded to see Maglie.
She promised not to assemble a coven here if I served her well.
Then he swayed dizzily and fell to his knees. Maglie has gone away. She is a threat to you no more, Isabel declared.
Gone away? Gone away? Then you must help me.
He pleaded as he ripped open his shirt to reveal a shard of stone protruding from his heart. A slow trickle of blood oozed from his chest with each heartbeat.
What a fool I am. Simply steer the wicked to me, she said, and she would give them their just deserts. And the good people, fearful and in despair, would turn to me to lead them. Well, I kept my end of the bargain, and yet now my heart bleeds.
The parson struggled to stand again. A thin fountain of blood spurted from his chest into Isabel's face as he collapsed in a heap.
Help me, wicked hag. I am a virtuous man.
Then he lay his head on the floor and groaned weakly as he lost consciousness. A pool of blood spread out from his body and soaked her bare feet. Isabel felt a jolt of strength surge inside her, and a shivering cold energy flowed through her body. The parson began to spasm. She needed to remove his stone while there was still time. But some of the blood had gotten in her eyes, and they burned terribly. She cleaned up with the rag she had used on Aaron. That's when she noticed that her fingers were no longer thin and bony, and the warts and moles that covered her arms were gone. She looked in the mirror opposite the fireplace. Her face had regained its youthful appearance. Her skin was fresh and dewy, and her lips were full. Her teeth were no longer rotten and exposed. She looked again at the parson breathing shallowly on the floor. She tried to feel pity for him, but somewhere virtue had been corrupted and innocence stained. He was the one who had roused the men to fight that night, knowing full well the powerful evil that waited for them. Isabel grabbed him by the ankle and lifted him into the air with ease. He moaned a bit as drips of blood fell from his chest onto her legs and feet. Her body flushed with an intoxicating power she had never felt before. "A pity how that works," she said, as she hung the parson by his feet from the rafters. The blood of a righteous man, so potent, yet so troublesome to attain.